So thank you, Christine. As Christine promised, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here and bring up the presentation. So my name is Kevin. I work with the National Constitution Center, which is a history museum, national town hall setting in Philadelphia. We're located in what some historians have referred to as the nation's most historic square mile. We're right across the street from the Liberty Bell and Independence Hall, the site of the signing of both the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. Here is a picture of us. And we were chartered, it was sort of a long process, as most things are. We were chartered in 1988, a near unanimous congressional act. We are chartered by Congress. We are on federal ground, but we are not a federal building. We're independent, and we were chartered with a mission to disseminate information about the Constitution on a nonpartisan basis. And that is something that we try to rigidly adhere to. And I want to go through sort of a little bit about our educational framework, sort of the steps that we use to deliver this information, and then to sort of share some resources that we use, and hopefully engage with you, find out if you have any questions about teaching these topics. I'd love to sort of hear, if you wouldn't mind putting in the chat, just to get a sense of kind of the age of students that you teach, the topics that you teach, whether these are primarily history, civics, social studies, all of the above, kind of what age group we're talking with here for teachers here in terms of the group of students, the level that you're teaching. So feel free to drop that in the chat. Let me know age group you're teaching, who you're teaching. Okay, English. Great, so primarily English here. Very good. All right, speech and debate. Certainly, that's very important. History, geography. Great. All right, excellent. So yes, and hopefully some of these topics, yes, we tend to see primarily sort of history, civics, certainly speech and debate. But hopefully a lot of these topics, when it comes to just having civil conversations, setting norms for how to have good conversations in the classroom. Certainly a lot of our resources are more geared toward the history and civic side, but can certainly be applicable in any subject that you're teaching, how to set up a good environment to have meaningful conversations and to have difficult conversations in the classroom. So we'll go through sort of some steps and some norms there. So that's sort of our breakdown for the day. I'll go over a little bit about the Constitution Center, the civil dialogue, and why we find that so important across any subject, really. Some of the norms and tips that we've found in sort of setting parameters to have these conversations. And then we want to share some of the resources that we have available free for teachers that hopefully you can find some use of in your classroom. So a little bit sort of about our expectations for this presentation, and hopefully just for everyone here, norms that we found, so I'm ready to engage. Feel free to share any stories that you've had in your classroom. Listen. We think about others' backgrounds, assuming good intent. These are things that we try to set up for any conversation that we have as adults, but also can be applicable for students and kind of, beforehand, setting up the parameters of, what are going to be the rules for this conversation before the conversation even starts, whatever it is that we're going to be talking about. What are collectively some rules that we want to have in the classroom? So that's really important. And we have a great activity that we'll be sharing a little bit later. It's sort of a self-report card for grading, how you engage with others, how you engage in having a conversation. So let me quickly go through a little bit about our background. I don't know if anyone has used the Constitution Center before, heard of it, or used some of our resources. But as we said, we were chartered by Congress in 1988. There's a Constitution Heritage Act. This is right after the bicentennial of the Constitution signing. And there was a lot of discussion at the time about the Constitution, what's in it, how do we have conversations about it? And people thought that that was a good thing. So it was decided that there should be some sort of structure within the vicinity of Independence Historic Park to be a place where people can come and have conversations related to the United States Constitution and related to our government as a way of increasing awareness about the Constitution. So that part's easy. We're right across the street. but also that second part, so about disseminating information about the Constitution on a nonpartisan basis, is one that we really try to take very seriously. We opened our doors officially on July 4th, 2003. So eagle-eyed observers of the date will note that that is a date more closely associated with the Declaration of Independence rather than the Constitution. Constitution Day is actually coming up September 17th. We just like to confuse people with the dates. But nonetheless, we are over 20 years old now. It's at our 20th anniversary this year. And we've really tried to develop a way of engaging in sort of an educational framework for engaging with students that, like we said, is primarily geared towards history, civics, government, but hopefully it's something that can be applicable for any subject. So I want to begin sort of with a story. And this is something that, you know, for a group of teachers, I certainly do not need to stress the importance of storytelling. And the teachers are phenomenal storytellers, and the teachers that I've had in the past, been fortunate to have had in the past, were always phenomenal storytellers, and the power of storytelling is so important. Right across the street from the Constitution Center and next to Independence Hall is this building, and this was almost the nation's first Capitol. The Capitol was in New York City for 2 years, and then for 10 years it was here in Philadelphia, and this is where Congress would have met. The House of Representatives was down on the first floor there, and the Senate was up on the second floor. This was the Congress Hall for 10 years. It was the nation's capital. And in 1798, there is a debate going on in the first floor of this hall. And it becomes what we'll say is not so much of a civil dialogue between two representatives, Matthew Lyon of Vermont and Roger Griswold of Connecticut. And if I remember the correct order of events here, Matthew Lyon, who was a member of, confusingly at the time, the Democratic Republican Party, was ignoring attempts from Griswold to get his attention. Griswold accused Lyon of being a coward and referred to him at one point as a scoundrel, which is a word that might not necessarily get your Twitter account banned today, but at the time it was one of the most egregious insults that you could level at someone. Lyon responded to Griswold's insult by spitting tobacco juice at him, at which point Griswold attacked Lyon with a cane. Lyon responded by grabbing a pair of fireplace tongs, and the two began jousting on the Congress floor. And as one alarmed observer noted, the two continued striking each other with sticks throughout the lobbies and endangering the safety of other members throughout the day. So what can we learn from this story? Well, for one, constitutional conversations have always been difficult, even from the founding. This particular debate in Congress was over impeachment. In this case, a signer of the Constitution named William Blount, who becomes the first federal official of any branch of government to be impeached. He got into land speculation, and it was not immediately clear what the procedure for impeachment was. And there was heated debate along party lines about what to do. So constitutional conversations have always been difficult. Maintaining a forum for civil dialogue is also very important. But also this story, as humorous as it might be, is a nice way of sort of illustrating the importance of storytelling. Where students who might not necessarily be enthralled at hearing a story about Congress in 1798 might be somewhat interested in stories of people jousting on the floor. And for those who say that, you know, Congress can't get along today, this is, as we see, nothing new. So stories like this, and stories that I'm sure you share with your students throughout the school year in the classroom, really serve as sort of the foundation for the first step of the center's educational framework. And that is a foundation through storytelling. And this is something, of course, that's applicable regardless of what you're teaching. Finding ways to engage students, either by using a particular story to introduce a topic, or by using it to illustrate a point that you're already making. You know, stories have a way of bringing students in and engaging them. And then once we sort of have that story that they're interested in, and for students, regardless of the subject, even if history might not be your favorite subject, if there's a particular time period, a particular figure from history, a particular movement, it's usually something that people can find interesting. So we start with that. We get that interest through storytelling. Then we try to use the resources that we have and that I will share with you today to sort of begin to look at those stories through the lens of the Constitution. How does this particular story, time period, movement connect to the Constitution, connect to a particular period of constitutional change, constitutional discussion, a particular amendment that was added? What is sort of the historic context? What is going on at the time? And how can we begin to think about this story in sort of constitutional terms? And then once we sort of have that extra knowledge, now we're ready to have a civil dialogue. We're ready to have that reflection and to have a meaningful discussion where we sort of have the tools that we need to engage and sort of a profitable back and forth. And even if it's a topic that might be somewhat contentious, we give students the tools so that they're ready to engage in a meaningful way. And one of the ways that we do that from a history constitutional perspective is to try to encourage students to separate their constitutional views from their political views. So we have our definitions up here. And in many ways, we've really boiled it down necessarily to a change in one word. So could I get a volunteer who would care to unmute themselves and read our very lengthy and thorough definition of a political question, please?
An issue of what the government or a government entity or agent should do.
Okay, great. Yes, thank you so much. An issue of what a government or government agency should do. And now we have our constitutional question. Can I get another volunteer to read our constitutional question, please?
An issue of what the government or a government entity or agent constitutionally made to.
Great. Yes, thank you. So most of the question is very similar, but we're really changing one word, and that is that word should. And of course, we all have our own thoughts and our own beliefs when having these discussions about, I really feel that the government should do this, or I do not feel that the government should do that. And of course, there is a time and a place for those conversations, certainly. And our views on those particular points are incredibly important, and we should be having those conversations. Within the framework of our program, though, what we try to do is encourage people to take that word should out of it. And what we try to do is get people to play the part of a lawyer or a judge and try to look at what the Constitution says the government can do or may do or is allowed to do, as we put in the chat there, should versus may. We had a scholar for one of our programs recently who said, we all have our thoughts about what we want the Constitution to say. But sometimes it's helpful to go back and just remind ourselves what it does say. And throughout all of the different topics that we feature that deal with the Constitution, whether it's the ideas of federalism and the separation of powers, whether it's the idea of freedom of speech, whether it's just simply having constitutional conversations and civil dialogue like this, we can find ways to frame discussions by using constitutional questions. So a good example of that is this one right here. One of the more popular topics that we have people ask us to engage in is the Fourth Amendment. So we have an example of a political question here. Should a public school principal search a student's locker? Now, imagine if you were to pose this question to your students. What do you think would be kind of the nature of their response? Maybe not so exactly what their answer would be, but how would they respond if you were to pose this question to your students? Should someone search your locker? Yep, exactly. Someone says, nope. Yep, that's about it. They would be uncomfortable. Sure. The answer would probably be brief. It might be emotional, exclamatory, no, absolutely not. And from there, that's largely the end of your conversation, really. Someone says, I've done this question before, and the answer is absolutely not. Sure. So what we already have here is a firm answer, perhaps a one-word answer, and someone's going to take a position that they're probably not going to want to budge from. So where do you really go with the conversation there? It would be pretty difficult. Whereas if you were to pose this question, the constitutional question, does the Fourth Amendment restrict the power of a government employee from searching a student's locker? So if you were to pose this question then to your students, how do you think they might react? And how might their reaction be different with framing it this way than asking the political question? Do you think that it might be different if you were to pose the question this way?
Well, the answer with the political question has a lot of personal feelings to it, whereas the constitutional question is based in evidence and facts and doesn't have those personal feelings associated with it, because it's not about that. It's not asking about your personal feelings. It's asking if the Fourth Amendment restricts the power, whereas the should and it's asking your political beliefs. It's asking about your beliefs. And so it's a different whole thing altogether, which is where our whole all of our issues are right now, right? Like everything that's blowing up in our world is right now is because it's our personal beliefs versus the constitutional foundations and that evidence and facts based. So the questions are really very, very different based on the evidence and those foundational pieces versus a belief and your values.
Absolutely. Yes. Thank you, Christine, for elaborating that. It can be opinion, it can be personal feeling versus trying to take some of that emotion out of it. And I think it was Leandra who said that you teach a speech and debate class. And we did this exercise recently with students in a speech and debate class. And one of the students raised their hand, I think they were in 10th grade, 9th grade or 10th grade. And they said, well, when I look at the first question, that's just not a good way of having a conversation. And in this class, we are graded not so much on being right or winning the argument, but on the quality of the back and forth nature of the discussion. So when you ask this second question here, as Christine said, there's so many different ways that you can take this conversation. What does the Fourth Amendment say? Let's go back and remind ourselves what the text says. What was the nature of the search? Does the Fourth Amendment allow that kind of search? Was there probable cause? Was there, not so much for the school saying, was there a warrant involved? Has there been a court precedent on this before? Has there been a case where a school brought a case to the court? So there's so many different ways that you could take this conversation, and there's also room for common ground. So, I would imagine most of the students are going to have the similar response to this particular political question. But we have other topics, such as these, where maybe there's a lot more disparity in terms of someone's political views. And if you have someone who's way over here politically and way over here politically about what should be done in this situation, maybe they can at least find some common ground in, I'm here and I'm here, but we both can agree that the text says this and this action can happen, even if maybe we strongly disagree on whether it should or should not. So there's asking constitutional questions allows the opportunity to introduce so many more avenues of discussion, so many more resources, and also as a way of finding some common ground and trying to take some of the emotion out of the conversation. So whether it's a topic such as free speech, Second Amendment, civil liberties, asking constitutional questions, which we try to provide. We've worked with scholars to think of what are some of the best ways to pose constitutional questions, and we provide those all on our website. Constitutional questions make them dig into the facts versus how they feel about it. Absolutely. Trying to take your own emotion out of it. You're not necessarily defending your own beliefs anymore. You're a lawyer analyzing what a document says. So it's a great way of sort of taking some of the emotion out of it, which can hopefully make for a more productive and less emotional conversation. So that's sort of a brief walkthrough of our sort of educational framework and how that informs how we pose those questions. In our next section, I want to introduce sort of a series of activities and some of the resources that we use. But before I do this, anyone have any questions about anything we've discussed so far? Anything relating to our educational framework or any of the sort of political versus constitutional nature of things? Any questions before we move on? Okay. And of course, if anyone does at any point, please feel free to interrupt. All right, now the most dangerous part of the presentation, which is where I have to try to do something technical. I want to share a quick video, and I want to make sure I can share the sound here. One of our most recent developments on our website is a brand new sort of constitutional curriculum. It's 15 weeks of resources, educational framework for teaching the Constitution. And within each of these, there are lesson plans, videos, anything that you might need. And you're welcome to pull, and I'll be sharing more about this resource in the next presentation. But one of those topics is civil dialogue. And we have a quick video here from our president and CEO, Jeffrey Rosen, on how to, and the importance of having civil dialogue in a conversation, in a classroom, in any setting. So let me attempt now to share this video, and please let me know if you can hear the sound. You'll know we have perhaps an unnecessarily dramatic soundtrack at the start of this video. So just give me a thumbs up if you can hear it.
Why is it important to have civil dialogues? Why is it important to listen to perspectives that you may not agree with in advance? Well, according to the founders of the Constitution, all of American democracy depends on your mastering this skill, because having civil conversations is central to the discovery and spread of political truth, and also to the rights and responsibilities of self-government. And the whole theory of American government is contained in one of the most inspiring Supreme Court opinions in history. It's called Whitney versus California, and it was written in 1927 by a great Supreme Court justice called Louis Brandeis. And I'm going to recite this inspiring paragraph for you, and then let's think together about how it really expresses the core of the American idea. Here we go. Here's Louis Brandeis in Whitney versus California. Those who won our independence believed that the final end of the state was to make men free to develop their faculties, and that in its government, the deliberative forces should prevail over the arbitrary. They valued liberty both as an end and as a means. They believed liberty to be the secret of happiness and courage to be the secret of liberty. They believe that freedom to think as you will and to speak as you think are means indispensable to the discovery and spread of political truth, that without free speech and assembly, discussion would be futile, that with them, discussion affords ordinarily adequate protection against the dissemination of noxious doctrine, that the greatest threat to freedom is an inert people, that public discussion is a political duty, and that this should be a fundamental principle of the American government. Wow, they're such inspiring words every time I recite them. I'm struck by how true they are, and let's unpack what Brandeis is saying. They believe that liberty was the secret of happiness and courage was the secret of liberty. That's a quotation from Pericles' funeral oration. So Brandeis is channeling the ancient political philosophy of Plato and Aristotle. And he's also been reading Jefferson over the summer of 1927. And those words, they believe that freedom to think as you will and to speak as you think Brandeis got, I believe, although he didn't attribute them, to a letter from Thomas Jefferson in 1820, where Jefferson used the same words. And Jefferson got those words, again, without attributing them. I just figured this out by finding the primary source from a series of Whig pamphlets called Cato's Letters, which the founders quoted a lot. And the idea is that the freedom of conscience or freedom of the human mind is a natural right. And we have not only a right, but a duty to exercise our freedom of thought, because we have a duty to cultivate our faculties of reason. Being guided by reason is the only way for what Brandeis called the discovery and spread of political truth. In other words, in America, no one has a monopoly on truth. The government can't tell you what to think. Your fellow citizen can't impose his or her beliefs on you. It's only through the process of political discussion that the truth emerges. And the best response to evil counsels is good ones, Brandeis says. And generally, truth is supposed to emerge from the marketplace of ideas. But Brandeis's central idea in this piece is not just the marketplace of ideas, which was actually a phrase attributed to a colleague of his called Oliver Wendell Holmes, but the idea that public discussion is a political duty. The only way that government can be responsive to the will of we the people is if we are completely free to express our perspectives. And that means all perspectives. That means perspectives that you may agree with and those that you don't agree with. And it's only by allowing all of those clashing and diverse perspectives into the public square that government can reflect the will of the people, which only emerges through this process of deliberation and debate. So now you see what we're doing here together is crucially important. We're learning how to be engaged citizens exercising the duty of public discussion. It's not just a right that you have, the government can't tell you what to think, but it's also a duty that you have to express your opinions thoughtfully and deliberately after listening to other points of view. And it's that process of listening to other points of view that allows you both to make your arguments persuasively, but also is a requirement of a open democracy. And that's why Justice Holmes, who I also mentioned, was so right when he said, the Constitution is made for people of fundamentally differing points of view. It's impossible to say it better, and that's why it's so important for you to listen to those differing points of view before you make up your own mind.
Okay. So, as I said, that is just, oops, need any more? Let's see. Great. So that is just one sort of snapshot of this new resource that we have available online. As we said, it's 15 weeks of accredited curriculum about all sorts of different constitutional topics. And the best part about it is you can kind of go all in. You can use as much of it as you want, or you can use as little of it as you want. I'll be the first to admit, when you look at that video there, it's very scholarly, relying heavily on primary resources. But that can also be a benefit when having these conversations in a classroom. If anyone has ever had any questions or people wondering, why are you choosing the resources that you are? This way we try to provide teachers with a plethora of primary resources that scholars from across the political spectrum have agreed are essential for teaching these key themes about free speech or separation of powers or areas of the Constitution. So we try to provide these resources for teachers to use, and it kind of comes with that accredited background that scholars, nonpartisan-wise, have agreed that these are things that students should be learning. And again, with primary sources, I've found, and I'd love to hear people's thoughts in the chat, to what extent do you use primary sources in the classroom? And have you had success with primary resources or challenges, maybe? How do your students generally respond when you utilize primary sources in the classroom?
I mean, that's, I kind of use them all the time. I guess I don't feel like they don't respond well. I think that they expect it when you teach social studies, and I think even in English and I mean, I think even in most subjects they kind of expect it now, and I think in Nevada especially we see it in the majority of subjects. Students are expecting to see primary sources. Starting in kindergarten, they're seeing them in most subject areas, and they're used to analyzing them, and we use really similar analysis sources, so like the Library of Congress and the National Archives, those types of analysis source materials, like those kinds of things. I think we all sort of use them. So I feel like students across the state are pretty used to those types of things. I don't feel like that's been abnormal for people. And students are pretty good about it and enjoy them, I think.
Great.
Yeah.
And we have another response in the chat. I love using primary resources. Some of the challenge is finding them. It can be overwhelming on some topics to find them. So thank you. Yes.
Yeah, I think finding them, I would say the written sources, like finding images is easy, obviously. I think written sources is tough for students when coming. So written sources like old cursive is really hard for students. That is difficult. So that takes a lot. That's a heavy load for teachers because you're basically transcribing them for students. So you show them like, this is what it looks like, but let me tell you what it actually says, because they have no idea how to read it. So that's a heavy load for teachers. So I think we really rely on places like the National Constitution Center and the Library of Congress and the archives and other places to do that heavy load, to find those sources and to do the heavy lifting of the transcribing and the work of kind of putting them in a presentable fashion for us, so that we can kind of give that to our students in a way that kids can manage it, because that is not manageable for kids. I would say that is for sure.
That's great. Yes. Thank you for raising those points. Absolutely. And it can be a challenge to find them and certainly to transcribe them. And we would like to think that, we have tried to make both easier. If you're looking for resources on our site, all of them are transcribed if they come from an era where things were primarily done in cursive text.
Yeah.
And we try to have an ample library. So particularly, this is one where we ask teachers if there are any topics relating to Constitution, American history, government. And in this case, we can go back into the founding era, Enlightenment and beyond, and ideas of thought about government. Please reach out. Let us know if there are any resources that you are looking for or having difficulty finding. And we can certainly do our best to, if we have them, we're happy to send them to you, or we can at least hopefully send you in the direction of where you might be able to find them. So if there are any that you're looking for or any difficulties finding them, please let us know.
Yeah.
Great. So if no one has any other questions, we'll move on now. In sort of thinking about having a civil dialogue, I'd love to hear sort of your norms, your ideas, like for your discussions. I don't know if this is something that you do at the start of the year, setting norms, establishing sort of standards for how you expect and how your students might expect conversations to go. So sort of begin to think about those. I'd love to hear, your thoughts about what you share in the classroom. And I also want to pull up these 4 definitions of civil dialogue. So if we can take maybe the next 2 minutes, we'll say, take a look at these 4 definitions, examples of civil dialogue. And I'd love to hear which one, if there's one in particular that really stands out to you, that you saw something in one of these definitions that really struck a chord that, this is kind of what I'm looking for in my classroom discussion. Which one of these did you most agree with? Take maybe 2 minutes or so, and then I'd love to hear your thoughts. Okay, and whenever anyone's ready, take it about another minute or so to continue reading them. But if someone has already found one that really sticks with you, feel free to put that in the chat. We can number them 1 through 4. And tell me why. Why is there one, or why did that particular definition stand out to you? All right, Aaron says number 4, it acknowledges that we need to listen to others and we should make our points without devaluing others' humanity. Thank you so much for sharing, Aaron. Absolutely. Any other definitions? What I have noticed that's interesting, and it tends to generally be across the board. This is number 2, allows us to talk, even if we, oh great, all the responses are coming in now, excellent. Even if we don't agree with one another's view, absolutely. So how to have conversation, and that was a line that our CEO was mentioning in the video. You know, the Constitution was made for people with fundamentally differing points of view. You know, if we all agreed on everything, then we wouldn't need to have discussions about how to keep dialogue civil. The conversations would be easy. But this is really important when people have strongly differing points of view, and how do we negotiate that? Enhance understanding, 3, because it clearly explains the reason. All right, and I would say this is the precedent that's being set. We generally never have teachers who will pick number 3 or will admit to picking number 3. And I wonder if that's because the source is Wikipedia and no one wants to pick that one. But generally we found that yes, across the board, people can usually find one or multiple of these. And sometimes, yes, even Christine is torn between 2 and 4, that there are areas sort of each that you'd like to sort of pull from in having these discussions. Engagement to enhance understanding. I agree with Aaron on number 4. I do like number 2 as well, though. Mutual respect, even with those whom you disagree, is something I think we can work to strive for. Absolutely. Yes. So how do we have these conversations, and how do we acknowledge, even going in, that people will disagree with you, and how do you negotiate that? So thank you all. One activity that we have also found that is interesting for students who come and do programs with us at the museum is to kind of have them do a self-report card. So we have, let's see here. These are sort of some examples that we had, and we'll go through each very briefly to sort of, you know, set your norms, almost like a self-reflection about how you react, how you respond in conversations. You know, everyone has been in arguments before, and to sort of take a moment and think, you know, how do I react? Because we find so often, I don't know if it's your experience, that when we do get into some arguments, we're focusing on the other person and thinking about how we're going to counter what they're saying. We're not necessarily thinking about our own actions and how we're behaving in these conversations. So a great response is with these, and of course I'll share the presentation at the end, but these are some examples that we'll use where students, if they're in person, will set out on the, I have the instructions here. This is sort of an activity where you can set out, you know, 5 different areas of the room, ranging from strongly agree to strongly disagree, and go through each one with the students and ask, you know, how do you react? So we'll sort of go through and take maybe no more than 15 or 20 seconds for each one. But within each of these scenarios, give yourself grades. Sort of think about how you react in conversations. And then at the end, if anyone would like to share, if there's one of these that particularly stood out to you, either from your own perspective or maybe one that you think this would be a really valuable question to ask the students in my class, I'd love to hear from you. So we have our first one here. I can remain calm when other people say things I dislike. So maybe think about that, for your own perspective, whether that's in the classroom, whether that's outside of the classroom, at home, with colleagues. Think about maybe how you react. I like that in the chat, I remain calm. Let there be one crazy person, not two. Absolutely. Yes, the idea of, if someone is being emotional, we don't want to be emotional necessarily. The importance of remaining calm. And there's a video at the end, a really kind of great snapshot of civil dialogue from a Supreme Court justice who visited the center that we'll share at the very end of the presentation. And again, this idea of remaining calm is important. All right, next one. I'm comfortably accept when students come to different conclusions, or reach different conclusions on controversial issues. So if you've had difficult discussions in the classroom and students, there is not a room consensus. Maybe you have different points of view and students can't necessarily come to an agreement. Okay, let's look at the next one. I become emotional when having a hard time explaining why I think people's points of view are wrong. Next one, this usually goes, one way or the other. I lash out at another person during an argument. All right, two more. I am able to exit a conversation without consensus. When you find yourself in an argument, are you okay to, if not necessarily agree to disagree, are you comfortable sort of stepping back and disengaging without having won the point? Or do you want to stay in there? Do you want to continue, on to another round? Continue the conversation to get your point across. All right, and then last one. I observe body language during a conversation. So again, is it difficult, focusing on the other person when you're having a conversation? Are you thinking about what you're thinking about, or are you eyeing them and thinking about, how they're reacting? So those are sort of our examples, our scenarios for the self-report card. Looking at these collectively, are there any that either struck a chord with you, maybe one way or another, you felt strongly one way or another? Or are there any of these that you think might provoke a good discussion if you were to present these to your students and ask your students to kind of engage in self-reflection and give themselves their own grades, sort of their own report card? Someone mentions this is great. Yes, it can be helpful sometimes just doing your own checklist, your own report card, but also having students sort of in front of the classroom, having them go to that particular corner of the room. and explaining why they are, they strongly agree with one point or they strongly disagree with another point. It can be a great way of sort of, even before the students engage in a difficult conversation, how have I reacted before? Have I been guilty in the past of maybe not actively listening to others, or maybe talking too loud and trying to overpower those I'm having a conversation with? And that can be it's a great tool, and most, without trying to impose new standards on people, have them come to their own conclusion that, maybe I could listen more. And that's a great way to sort of get them thinking even before you outline your norms for a conversation and what you expect in the classroom. So sort of on that note, getting closer to the end here, are there any norms that you have found successful in your classroom? We all have sort of our goals, our parameters, our rules. Or, we're not going to yell, or we're going to listen to others. Are there any standards that you have in your classroom, sort of established norms that you've found have worked for you, that before you ask your students to engage in what could be a difficult conversation? Are there any norms that have really worked for you, sort of a standard in the classroom that you have found to be helpful, beneficial?
One of the biggest things, my children go to a school that's kindness above all. And I know that seems really simple, but it's really simple. And it's something that it's a K-8 school, and it's something that kindergartners all the way to 8th graders can follow. And it's something that is written on wall. They have a big mural. It's something that the kindergartners all the way to 8th graders, that it's really easy for the teachers and the students to all be able to say. And so it's just a really, really simple kind of mantra that everybody talks about. And so kindness above all. Are you being kind? Are you being kind to yourself? Are you being kind to your neighbor? And so no matter what, are we using kindness? And so it seems like overly simplistic, but sometimes that's what we need in this world, is just kindness. And so that is our baseline norm for everything we do at that school. I volunteer a lot there, and I do a lot of teaching there. And that is something that we really, really always start with, is kindness. So that's how we start with them. Yeah.
That's great. Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing. I create a classroom contract at the beginning of the year where the students set the norms and standards, and we continually reference back to them as we move through different activities. We base it off the question, what do you need to be supported and included in your classroom? And thank you, Lanzer, for sharing. That is so important. And for the students themselves to think about what they expect, what they want to have in the discussion, what they expect, how they expect to be treated, how they promise to treat others. Having the students contribute to coming up with the norms, that can be so important as well. We're all here together. It's a contract is a perfect word for it. We're all coming to the table, and we're all going to agree to abide by these rules when having a conversation. And that's absolutely great. Thank you so much for sharing. All right, so now just in the last few minutes, I do want to share this last video. Some of the resources that we have on the website that we've alluded to, and I will share this presentation at the end, are about having constitutional conversations. And within each of these different topics, there are things like our interactive constitution, where we have top scholars come together and they strongly disagree. So reminding students that if you're disagreeing on something, that's okay. People have been disagreeing about these things for a long time, and people who are paid to be experts on these things strongly disagree. So if you're disagreeing, that's not necessarily that you're doing anything wrong. Disagreement is fine. And in many cases, in this particular subject, even encouraged. So the disagreement's fine. It's how you go about the nature of your disagreement. So one exercise that we did to bring these scholars in was to have them each write their own essay about a particular conversation, in this case, freedom of speech. And then we had them do a common interpretation essay metaphorically lock them in a room together, and you have to write something that you both agree on. So between those three, either using the common interpretation or kind of point counterpoint, those resources can be useful for having students either argue a different point, or looking at, here we have two people who might strongly disagree, and how did they find common ground? What were points that they agreed with? And Christine, thank you. That's so exciting to say that you use this resource. Absolutely. And it can be so important. And we use these for kind of across the board, all of the constitutional themes that we cover. We also have within our website there's a bracket for sort of searching by topic. We have a whole civil dialogue toolkit that sort of outlines different methods of interpretation, different constitutional activities, sort of like the self-report card that we just did, different tools, different activities, examples of norms, ways to sort of go about having a constitutional conversation. And again, we brought teachers together, scholars, a lot of people sort of put their own eyes on this document. And it's a useful toolkit to have. And I'll share that in the chat during the video. And also we find within this toolkit just methods for constitutional interpretation. And again, even justices of the court, as we well know, strongly disagree at times. So even if theoretically the highest thinkers on these subjects can disagree, then students, it is okay to disagree. It's just how you go about doing it. So in sort of conclusion here, as we wrap up, a few years ago, now retired Chief Justice Stephen Breyer visited the Constitution Center and was talking to a group of students and was posed this question: do you and the other justices ever get into fights, ever get into arguments when having conversations? And he responded, and it was about 4 minutes of just civil dialogue gold. And we share this video whenever we're talking about civil dialogue. We just find it so important. So as hopefully the sound works again, but think about maybe what are some norms, what are some rules of discussion, what are some words that Justice Breyer really cites here, and maybe going through what is one thing that he said about kind of the norms on the court that surprised you in this discussion. So we got about 4 minutes of Justice Breyer, and let's see if it works. Once again, thumbs up if you can hear, and go.
Good afternoon. I'm Andrew Lofton from Constitution High School. Do you ever get into arguments with other members of the Supreme Court?
Yes.
And if you do, how do you solve those issues?
Well, what we do after we hear a case, we'll hear a difficult case, and then first, almost all of it's done in writing. I mean, I have these documents called briefs. I'm carrying them around with me now. I have them in my bag. I was reading them in the car coming up. And in each case, different sides file briefs. In the case I just talked about, there were 100 briefs. I couldn't, the schools, different schools filed briefs. The Army filed a brief. We had all kinds. So I read those. Maybe in a typical case, there are 10 or 15, 20. Then we'll have an oral argument, oral procedure. And that is maybe half an hour each side. The lawyers will argue. We'll ask questions. Then within a day or two, we're in our conference room, the 9 of us. That conference room has a big table. It's probably about the size of the bottom of the auditorium here. And we sit around the table. No one else is in the room. And we discuss the case. When we're discussing the case, the Chief Justice is here. He has a little book. And he says, the issue in this case is ... And here's how I feel about it. Then it goes to Justice Scalia, Justice Kennedy, Justice Thomas, Justice Ginsburg, me, Justice Alito, Justice Sotomayor, Justice Kagan. And we each have a book, and we each write down what the others say. Because if I didn't write down what you said, for example, and I had to write the decision, you might not agree with it. So I write down what you say. Then there's back and forth discussion. I listen to what you say. And I try to see if I have something that's relevant to what you're talking about. It isn't just who has the better argument. It's a question of listening to each other. Now, on the basis of that discussion, we work out, well, how we're probably going to decide the case. The case is then assigned to one of us to write, and we write a little essay. And we circulate it in the court. And I hope that the other judges, or at least 5, will join my opinion. If they don't, they might write a dissent. Eventually, everybody joins an opinion, or writes a dissent and joins that, and that's the end of the case. The majority rules. If there are 5 or more, that's the answer. Now you are an expert. And your real question is, does that discussion make a difference? And the real answer is yes. And when you talk about argument, you're thinking, well, how do we do that argument? Do we shout at each other? I mean, some of these are pretty contentious cases. No, we don't shout at each other. I've been there for 20 years, and I have never heard in that room, never heard one justice raise his voice and shout at another. Just does not happen. I have never heard one judge say something rude or make a joke even about another. Doesn't happen. It's civil, and it's polite, professional, even though we might strongly disagree. So I've learned over time that if you have a friend and you're disagreeing about something and you're in a big argument, what works best is stay calm. Stay calm. Listen to what he's saying. Try to deal with what he's saying, not with what you're saying. What do you think he's thinking about? He's thinking about what he's saying. He's not thinking about what you're saying. Otherwise, he'd agree with you, wouldn't he? And so listen to him and stay calm. If you do not stay calm, he's going to think, my God, that guy's really emotional. He must be wrong. You see, isn't that how people think?
Yes.
Yeah. So therefore, what I've learned is the 2 rules in there, in that conference room: don't speak twice till everybody has spoken once. That is a great rule for whatever group you're involved in, because everybody thinks they've been treated fairly. And then stay calm and listen and respond to what the other person has said. You would be surprised. You would be surprised at how often you can work things out. And if you do, you don't even have to get into court in the first place.
No. All right. So we have sort of that great, sort of 4 minutes of discussion from Justice Breyer, and I know we're just about out of time, so let me go ahead and put the presentation in the chat there, and then the civil dialogue toolkit that has been so helpful. But in the last 30 seconds or so, does anyone have any questions? Was there anything that Breyer said in that chat that really resonated with you? And we're just about out of time. Yes, a question of listening to each other is so key, and that is so important in having these conversations. So everyone, I want to thank you so much for listening to me today. I'm sorry I brought us right up to the end of our time. If anyone has any questions, needs any resources, please feel free to reach out. We're always available. But I want to thank you all for joining me on a Saturday, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. So Christine, I'll turn it back over to you.
All right, I'm going to stop the recording.